Welcome to the Dibley Diaries for this week. This week it's Palm Sunday, and we're going to be thinking about the things that happened on Palm Sunday and some of the things that didn't happen on Palm Sunday or in Holy Week as well. But I wanted to start by thinking about what it means for a rural church to celebrate Holy Week and what happens for people who don't go to church quite so frequently around Easter. So I think it's a really important thing to think about. So we've got Palm Sunday tomorrow. And if you don't have an opportunity in your church to have a Maundy Thursday service or a Good Friday service, you can go straight from Palm Sunday to Easter Sunday without thinking about all the events which happened in between. So some big urban churches will have a service every day this week. The Maundy Thursday services might be quite long. There might be a vigil, there might be services and a vigil on Friday as well. There might be services on Saturday, and it may be an Easter vigil on Easter Eve on Saturday, and so there'll be all these other things that can be done. So I think it's a real challenge for us in a rural situation to provide the bits in between for the services, so that people can focus not just on the joys of Palm Sunday, although we're going to talk about that a bit later, from Palm Sunday to Easter Day without going on the journey in between. And it may be that those are the occasions when you try to gather people from other parts of your group or your benefice together, so that we don't get stuck in the joy without having experienced the sorrow of the story as well. You don't get the whole arc of the narrative of Holy Week without actually spending some time with the more difficult parts of the story around Maundy Thursday and Good Friday. So that's a rural challenge this week. How do we provide a rounded Easter provision for people without them going straight from Palm Sunday to Easter Day with none of the rest of the journey in between? For this week's Thought for the Week, we are thinking about the narrative of Palm Sunday from Mark 11 verses 1 to 11, what it says there about what Jesus did and about what that might feel for people who are actually in Jerusalem at that time. And I normally only have two Palm Sunday sermons. I have the superhero sermon and I have the donkey sermon, but this year I've been really challenged to think about it in a different way. So on Palm Sunday, Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a donkey and is greeted by crowds. They shout Hosanna, and they put their cloaks down and they wave their palm branches, and that's why we call it Palm Sunday. And Jesus is greeted in this really triumphal way, sometimes called the triumphal entry. I've been really struck thinking about Palm Sunday this year, about what it's like to really be in there, what it is really like to be in Palm Sunday. And it's the same problem that we have every year with Easter, in that we already know the end of the story. We already know what's going to happen, and that's quite a difficult thing to imagine ourselves being in the story and not knowing what's actually going to happen. Sometimes I do an exercise for this with modelling clay. I get people to model little models of themselves, and we place them onto a kind of set where we reenact with the models the Palm Sunday story. It's a very kind of kinesthetic way of doing a bit of Ignatian imagination of oneself in the text. So we think about Palm Sunday and we think about the people who are there and what it's like to be there. But Jerusalem was a very troubled place. It was a really troubled place, and I think that people would have been worried that there really was going to be a war, that actually this could incite the level of disruption that would mean that actually armed conflict could break out. Jesus was riding in on a donkey, so the Romans thought he was an idiot on a donkey up to some point, but they had advisors. They would have kind of known what was going on. Jesus was coming in from the east into a very, very busy, crowded city. I've often wondered why Jesus didn't stay in the city, but actually looking into the details a bit more, it would have been absolutely crammed with people, and whilst it was a very small geographical area, it was really crammed with people in part of the city, people who were really affected by poverty. It would have been very insanitary and crowded conditions. Part of Jerusalem was very lovely. The temple had been rebuilt by the Herod dynasty. They were trying to make themselves so Jewish, and then there were palaces up there and there was a fortress up there, but in the lower parts of the city it was squalor. It was really pushed in together. So when the people saw Jesus coming and they were shouting Hosanna, which means rescue us or save us, and then I wonder what they were wanting to be saved from. So maybe they were wanting to be freed from the Romans. That was a very real threat to them. And one of the things which I find really intriguing about this story is Jesus was coming in from the east around that time. We don't know exactly when. Pilate would have been coming in from the west, bringing the ceremonial garments and extra Roman troops to come in for Passover. So the Jews couldn't do the Passover ceremony without the ceremonial garments, which the Romans held hostage. Pilate rode in from Caesarea into the west side of the city, in the same kind of period that Jesus was riding in from the east, but Pilate would have ridden in with the garments, with his elite troops, with that kind of hand of Roman jurisdiction, and Jesus was fomenting this kind of tumult of people shouting and calling out on him to save them, saving them from all sorts of things. So saving them from the Romans, saving them possibly from the Herodians. The Herodians were a brutal dynasty, and it's not without cause that Caesar Augustus once said that it's safer to be Herod's pig than his son, and saving them from the poverty, and the poverty which meant that they couldn't be righteous according to the rules. They couldn't be righteous according to the rules because poverty prevented them from doing the purity things that were demanded by the people with money. The people in power with money said you must be able to keep yourself pure and clean and all those sorts of things and separate in a way that just wasn't possible for the poorest in those communities. I am concerned. I think if I was there, I would be with the Kaiser chiefs. I would be predicting a riot, and I think people would have been really scared. People would have been scared about what was going to happen to them at that time. What happens? Jesus rides in, he has a look around, and he goes back to Bethany, goes back to his friend's house where he's staying. So there's no armed conflict straight away, there's no riot, there's no terrible thing straight away. Yes, people will die eventually, including Jesus, and there will be some trouble. There's always trouble at Passover. It's renowned for being festivals, for being a difficult time. But one thing that has happened or will happen is that God has a plan which people don't imagine. People can imagine that there's going to be trouble and there's going to be bloodshed and that there might even be war and there might be violence, but people aren't imagining what God's plan for victory really is. God is doing something that they can't imagine. Jesus has tried to tell them, and that led to this whole spat between Peter and Jesus, about Peter saying this can't happen. Jesus has been trying to tell them what God's plan is, and everybody has not been understanding it because they can't imagine God's plan. They could imagine a riot, they could imagine warfare, they can imagine victory, they can imagine freedom, but what they cannot imagine is what actually happened. And that's why we need to stay with the story through Holy Week to see out what happens, God's plan, which is beyond our imagining. The Dibley moment of the week this week is about something which actually happened with a palm which was brought into our church building. It was actually on Easter Day, but we're bringing up some symbols, and it was the Palm Sunday palm that we brought up. It was fine. During the first hymn it started to lean into the Easter candle, and somebody spotted just before there was it caught fire properly that it had fallen and was beginning to smoulder, and they went and rescued it so that we didn't have a fire actually in our church building for Easter Day. So my advice, if you're bringing palm branches or anything like that into your church building this Easter, please make sure they're not near the candle so you don't end up with a conflagration. That's it for the Dibley Diaries for this week. I pray that you and your village, however large or small, have a really blessed week where you can spend time with the whole of the Easter story, with the Holy Week narrative leading up to Easter Day.